I must tell you that I started as a preacher on note in the circus. The circuit. And actually not far from here, I don't think. I've lost my bearings, having been moved out of Pretoria by the church in 1973. But I did my first little bit at, Littleton. It was Littleton Church. That's really where I started. So you're reasonably responsible for the way I've turned out. I must make some confession to you. I was doing my third year in philosophy and English and psychology at UNISA, and Arthur Weston. Can you remember Arthur Weston? Arthur Weston came to see me and said that he'd heard from my family that I was intending to go into the ministry. So he asked me what theology books I was reading. And that certainly, I was hardly even reading the Bible at that stage. So he kind of put me through all my paces, and there were two books that we had to be examined on. The Bible, Its Meaning and Purpose by E.W. Grant. I don't know whether you remember that. And An Approach to Christian Doctrine by Lewis. Not C.S. Lewis. Greville P. Lewis, if I remember correctly. And I started reading these books, and I must be honest with you, they were boring beyond boring. So I failed my candidates examinations over here, 28% for theology, because I was just writing from my Sunday school knowledge, for both subjects. And God's got a way of getting us, because I then was appointed as supervisor of studies many years later in the Grahamstown district. In about, I think it was 1979 or 80. And I was district supervisor of studies for about nearly 20 years. And had to prepare candidates with those two books. So eventually I knew the Bible, Its Meaning and Purpose, and An Approach to Christian Doctrine. So that's, I thought, was going to be a good introduction if you think that you're going to get away with it after I've spoken to you today. Clearly, inequality is a constant in our experience of life. Jesus says to Judas and to the disciples, after that woman comes in and breaks that very expensive perfume over his feet, surely this could have been sold and the money given to the poor. And Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. But she has done a beautiful thing for me. And so that does not mean, I don't think, que sera, sera. You could never imagine that about Jesus' ministry, particularly considering where his footsteps took him. But also to say that as we read Scripture, one of the amazing things about it is that it kind of has a way of, being found in the streets and in the villages and in the cities of South Africa. Sometimes you can read a passage of Scripture and you can think, let me give you an illustration. I got involved in Kulini. Now, you know what happened in Kulini. A young boy, a 16-year-old, stole a sunflower for the seeds, obviously. And he ended up dead. And because of the work I'm doing on hearings, I went off and first of all went to a meeting in Lichtenberg, because the community in Kulini exploded into anger. You with me? Any rate, so I was eventually, to cut a long story short, taken into Kulini to his home. And what I saw there was, well, really nothing less than appalling. Walked in to the room where his mother was sitting nursing a baby. And the baby was the closest thing that I have ever seen to Kwashiorkor. You know, these big eyes staring at you out of a skull, basically. And you looked at his mother, and his mother, I don't think any nourishment could have been coming out of that body. And for a sunflower. And so when one reads, for instance, in Leviticus, when you plow your fields, don't go over them a second time. Leave stuff on the edges of your fields so that the poor can come and maybe even make a living off what you leave behind. When you glean your grapes, don't go over them again to make 100% certain that you've got every morsel of profit that you can make out of it. Leave stuff there for the marginalized, the forgotten, the on the edges of society. And then you leave Kulini and you come and you read that passage. And then since then, I have had occasion to meet with all sorts, One of the people that has worked alongside me there has been the Dutch Reformed minister, strangely enough. I can't get the Methodists to join me. I can meet in the Anglican church, but the Methodist church is basically locked in that township, and all the rest of it. And the Dutch Reformed Church, who would have expected that? And we've had meetings in the Dutch Reformed Church, and the most helpful people in the Dutch Reformed, with the Dutch Reformed Church, have been these, Jesus in a bottle and Jesus on a tree churches all over the place. The evangelical, Pentecostal, they really have ultimately provided some kind of social cohesion and access. In fact, there's a woman who happens to be the chair of the ANC Women's League in the township, but she's also a minister. And she's married to a Nigerian. And so it's, from a theological point of view, from Lewis and an approach to Christian doctrine, she's on a pear tree somewhere. You understand? But the journey with those people has been phenomenal, to the extent now, listen to this, this is being in touch with the community. Her brother was robbed by the gang in the township, because there are gangs in the township. And the gangs recruit little people from 5, 6 years old. And Bella knows the people, and so eventually found her brother's stolen goods. The long and the short of it is that the gangs have asked if they can meet with me so that we can begin to start talking about where they're going. And why are they in gangs? They're into the stuff. The fundamental stuff is food. Why are you in gangs? Because we're hungry. And people don't want to give us food. So the only thing that we can do is to organize ourselves properly and get food for ourselves. And you're living, you must remember, you're living in incredible circumstances. I mean, the sunflower harvest and then the maize harvests in those places are phenomenal. Phenomenal. And so some of the people in those areas who come to church Sunday by Sunday, because of course now I'm connected with the Dutch Reformed Church and I meet with the farmers. We had a session where the farmers said to me, primarily, actually it wasn't the farmers, it was the chairperson of the Northwest Agri Forum, said to me, you must not think that this place is going to be like Zimbabwe. I'm telling you, we're ready and we're waiting. So it's been, and then at the end of a very emotional meeting, because the farmers, are, in my opinion, need a hearing because they are so traumatized with the murders that have taken place on the farms around them, you know, so that it might not have happened on my farm, but when I hear what happens on your farm, I can't just listen to that and not think, when is it coming my way? So it's a complex of issues that are happening around our country, and where, as Christian people, one of the lectionary readings from this last Sunday was, you are salt and you are light. And if salt has no value, you can't really taste the difference of one food type from another. We are intended to make a difference to the flavor of humanity in this time in which we live. And you're light. And so no matter how difficult it is, you have to struggle for the truth, because ultimately that truth must liberate you. You know, if I've got to come with my very conservative upbringing, as it were, those young kids should be taken and be given a very, very good hiding so that they never think of going into a gang again. You know what I mean? They are in the gangs because it provides food, it provides a place of belonging, it provides a place of security, it provides everything that should be in a home. And the phenomenon is becoming more and more and more and more apparent as an emerging narrative. Let me give you another illustration. So where I live, you might have heard of it last week, there was an attack on the Somalis for selling old food. Can you remember? In White City. That's exactly where I live. And the shop that was on my way here, I got a message from the shop owner, Mohammed. And you know what I discovered? That 7 people that live on the property that that's this community center, were involved in helping themselves in pillaging from his shop. Now, on the one hand, I can understand it. On the other hand, I gave them an experience of my anger. I have. You know? One of them's name's Honest. I baptized him Dishonest. And they now are more traumatized than the Somalian was after I've had them for a couple of hours and reimagined their brains for them. You with me? Because they are vulnerable. You know, they are vulnerable. They are refugees. Dishonest is in actual fact an orphan. So the struggle with inequality calls us into all sorts of nuances about who we are as human beings, in terms of meekness, in terms of humility, in terms of struggling for justice, in terms of all the rest. I must tell you a story. When I was in Roodepoort at Princess Church, I had been involved in the Eastern Cape in what they called the Detainees Counselling Service. And one of the people in that Detainees Counselling Service was a woman called Molly Blackburn. Now, Molly Blackburn was killed in a motor car accident. And she phoned me just after I had arrived in Roodepoort, and she said to me, "Listen, Paul, there is a young man, Fort Tralata and Mbulelo Goniwe, who have been taken into detention in Sun City under Section 28. Now, you couldn't connect with people under Section 29, but Section 28 you could actually go and visit people. So I went and visited Fort in Johannesburg Central Prison. And I mean, obviously everything that we did in that prison was recorded and all the rest of it. And we eventually got into the whole discourse on communism. Now, Fort was the grandson of Canon James Tralata, who was the first General Secretary of the ANC. But in 1984, you must know, that was a real cha, you understand? He was a school teacher. He was eventually released, sent down to the East and back home, but they wouldn't let him teach, obviously, because now he's going to start influencing the whole township. And then he came back to stay with me in Roodepoort so that we could organize for him to get a driver's license, heavy-duty driver's license, so that he could support his wife and children back. He had at that stage 2 children. And he went back, and on one dreadful return journey from Port Elizabeth, 4 of them were completely eliminated. And I mean, the way that they were killed, I mean, it was perverse, to say the least. What on earth people get about cutting off people's fingers and burning parts of their bodies, and the pathologist's report were appalling. At any rate, to cut a long story short, I was at the funeral with one of our previous presiding bishops, Mvume, and the Sunday Times took a photograph of us this way. And it was Mvume and myself, and behind us was the communist flag. Priests march under communist flag. So when I got back to little conservative Princess, you can imagine. You can just imagine. And there was a security policeman's son who was part of my congregation. What did you do? So I got out of the pulpit and I let them ask me questions. And I will never forget, one of the questions was, "Are you a communist?" Well, obviously. And so I said, "If you're asking me whether I am an atheist, then I need to say to you, absolutely, without reserve, no. I believe in Jesus Christ. But I must also say to you I do find that some of Marx's teachings are instructive in terms of how we organize ourselves politically, economically. Make sense? That some of the stuff around socialism does open up a space. You know, you happily belong to the Methodist Church, but I don't know whether you're aware of the fact that the first trade union was in actual fact a Methodist class meeting. That a lot of our structures in the Methodist Church are not too far from the trade union movement, by the way, which is supposed to be so communist. The one thing I do agree with Marx about is this. We have to be so careful that our religion isn't a drug. That you come to church on Sunday and you Jesus kicks you into the goal, through the goalposts of time. You know that song? Drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalposts of time. And that in actual fact, our religion has absolutely no impact on society. None. And in actual fact, when a minister dares do what I've been doing with you this morning, you know, I'm so sick and tired of hearing politics from the pulpit. Do you honestly believe in Mickey Mouse Jesus, who sits in a little corner over there and doesn't have any impact on conscience, on justice, on money, on politics? I think Jesus was a heavy politician. That's ultimately why they needed to get rid of him. Because he discomforted the Pharisees and the scribes, because he enabled them, whether they liked it or not, to see the relevance of Christ to the sick, to the marginalized, you can't get away from it, to the mad. And that's not just interesting stories, you know. That model is set before us so that we have to struggle to become like that. Otherwise, I hate to tell you, religion is a mere performance. So I want to read two stories to you. And I'm going to read in Matthew chapter 25. And let me just say something to you. It's good to read the story, not in chapters, if you know, and verses, because that's how it was originally written, you know. So I'm going to give you some of the background. Some of the background is the first parable in chapter 25 is a parable about the 10 virgins, 5 foolish, 5 wise. Be prepared. In other words, be prepared. Don't abandon your responsibilities, more or less. And then the parable of the talents. And you know the parable of the talents, okay? And the parable of the talents are about giving, I'm not sure what it is, 5 talents. 5, 2, and 1. All right? And the person who's given 5 makes another 5, 2 makes another 2. Well done. But I knew you were hard, so I buried my talent. Here it is, back to you. Sorry, I didn't clean off the soil, but there it is, to give it back to you. Get out of my sight. And the same thing is used in both of them. Okay? Knock, knock, knock. Please, we're late, I know. Get out. And then he takes this one who saved his money and gave it back to him exactly as it was. And it ends with those beautiful words, and throw that worthless servant outside into darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And now I'm going to read you the story that comes next. So hold those two stories in your mind. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger," or a foreign national, "and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you, a stranger, and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" He'll reply, "I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. And then, sorry, these are really hectic passages, aren't they? There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came for when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abram's side. The rich man also died and was buried in hell, where he was in torment. He looked up and saw Abram far away, with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abram, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abram replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abram replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abram," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And I think you've asked for a kind of Christian response to the inequities. The one thing that I disagree with Karl Marx about is that religion is a drug to put you to sleep, and therefore there is no God. And I think that in 2018 that is our responsibility, to prove on that point that Karl Marx is wrong. That because we believe, we will make a difference. It might be just recognizing the beggar at the side of the road. Isn't it interesting that often what one does with a beggar is smudge them out of identity? And in that story, the only one who has identity is Lazarus. The rich man is faceless, really. And our big challenge is, I think, continually being alert. I do want to say to you that in this country, I think that the most profound danger we have is the distance between the filthy rich and the abject poor.
You know, you get people that come to your door or your gate now that's closed. I, as a woman, do not feel safe going there and when they ask for bread or something, I'll have to ask someone else to go to the gate because I'm so terrified that I might get shot. And yet I want to help. How do you overcome that?
How does a person judge how much you must give? I read a book once that said, if you feel so strongly that you give lots away, you will end up also being a poor. Rather, invest, and the interest you have on whatever you've invested, that you give to the poor. So how does somebody know exactly when they are doing the right thing and giving the right amount?
But the difference from when we were children to where we are now, our children, my son was in a school in Pretoria where he was the only white man. The rest of all Africans, all other nationalities. So are we improving, in way, or is this going to cause more trouble?
Let me say that all three questions, in one way or another, really need more than, a bag of expert knowledge to be shoved onto the thing. You with me? I mean, for instance, your question deals with the considerable trauma that there is in the whole country around violence. Are you with me? And that ultimately and let me just say that I think that the inequality in the country exacerbates that kind of, that danger, if you know what I mean. And drives a wedge into, it's not a racial issue, that issue. You with me? I mean, in parts of the Northwest. So, for instance, let me give you three illustrations. There's the sunflower issue. There's another issue of a young man who was shot in the leg for stealing oranges in Majakaneng. He's disappeared. And the suspicion from the lawyers who are dealing with the case is that his body's been thrown to the crocodiles. And then there's another narrative in Sannieshof, where there was a mentally disabled person who found his way onto somebody's farm and was beaten so badly, ended up in hospital and died. So the narrative, for instance, from black people in the Northwest, is that white people are dangerous. They're armed, and they are pernicious and intolerant. You with me? So my sense to begin a journey with you is that there may be value, for instance, in creating a group where people can talk about the trauma that they've been through, all the things that they are scared about. Some of those things are realistic. Some of those things have got to be put into perspective. You know, people ask me, so you live in Soweto, aren't you scared? You know, as if I live amongst a group of barbarians. You with me? Now, I've lived in Soweto now for 31 years. Yes, there have been 2 occasions when I've been shot at, and my life has been in danger. Yes. But I have not been prepared to allow that stuff to prevent me from having to do my ministry. You know? So I think, to come back to your very specific question, what if the person at the gate has got a gun? How do you think, let's ask the audience, how do we handle that kind of thing? How do I allow, because I'm hearing from you, my spirit tells me I have to have compassion. How do I have compassion in the face of fear? What do I do with it? Now, you know, the other day I was driving here through Marabastad, and I had my window open, little bit, that one, you know, the passenger. And this man came and put his hand through the window and took my diary. I mean, which is more important to me than anything else. I want to tell you, I created such a noise. And having preached at Central Methodist without a microphone, I can deafen you when I really go up a couple of decibels. And eventually I stopped all the traffic with just the noise I was making in my little Kia. You understand? And I was furious with him. You understand? But I'm not going to stop going through Marabastad, not on your life. I want to find him. So my response to fear is anger. You know, the one time I was shot at, I must tell you the story. I'd come, and it was, I can still remember, it was the 26th of November. It was the day I married Smanga Kumalo to his wife. And I'd come back from doing a wedding, and I was carrying a whole lot of stuff in my arms, you know. And I got out of my car on this side, walked around this side, and as I got to this part of the car, a young man came with a gun and said, "Give me your keys." So I said, "What did you say?" And he fired a shot. I said, "What did you say?" He said, "Give me your keys." Fired a shot. I said, "I don't care what you do to me, I'm not giving you my damn keys." Fired another shot, and then pulled the trigger, and I then, by that stage, was saying, it's just a cap gun, you know. So I thought, but I better get out, ran down to my thing, and he fired another shot. Got into my room, I was carrying clothes, and put the clothes that I'd been wearing into the basket, and lifted my stole, and the stole went, do, do, do. A thing on the journey to the new land in Benoni. So I thought, well, I better go and tell my bishop about this, because there'd been a hang of a lot of stuff around me at that stage. And I went, and James Massey, who was my colleague in the education, was sitting near the back, as he always did, doodling with something or other. And I called him out, and we found 2 bullets in the stole. There were 2, you know, the 2 bullet holes, 3 bullet holes were there, and I mean, I was carrying it here, you understand? So he was quite accurate. At any rate, the next week I was at a Sunday school meeting, and I got a message from the sister-in-law of Mrs. Sisulu, and the message said, "Tell Paul not to worry. The young man who was up to nonsense this last Saturday, we have found him and we've dealt with him." I didn't want to know what they'd done, but that never happened there again. You know, the important thing that you raise is that when you start engaging, it's not a free-for-all.
It's not a what?
Free-for-all. And there can be no guarantee that as one starts making the small differences to justice that you won't become a target. Sometimes it helps to organize groups that can care for the people who come from house to house. Sometimes it helps that you try and put in place things that don't leave you singularly vulnerable. But I cannot say to you, there's a guarantee of your safety. I happen to think that one of the reasons Jesus was crucified was because of his insistence on caring for the poor. And in trying to, in actual fact, recognize that our journey has to be one of, as Christ follows, one of generosity. But that's not the end of it. So it's two things I'm saying. First of all, there's no guarantee. But secondly, if there are some of you who are traumatized because of something that has happened to you, form some kind of support group. Last week on Friday, I was in Eshowe in northern Natal, and we had a hearing. And there must have been about 30 women in the room. The first time I went to Eshowe, there were same number of women, and they were receiving a report from the Tear Fund, who had done research in the area around the rape of women and the abuse of women. There were 17 women in that room that had all experienced rape. And they have created a support group for not what they call victims, but for survivors. I think, for instance, those farmers in the Northwest need to get into a group so that they can begin to start turning the narrative from resistance and anger and hatred, ultimately, into a place of healing and a place of empowerment. I'm telling you, those farmers could do stuff with the poorest of the poor on their farms that could transform that whole area so that you would not find a hungry person there. They've actually said it. One of the older farmers has said, one of the biggest problems we have in this area is food security. And it's sinful that we who make food can't enable everybody on our land to not be hungry. So that's an answer there. To speak to your question, I don't think that there are rules. I must be honest with you. But except one rule, which is the rule of generosity. The rule of in a sense. So sometimes you might in actual fact take the shirt off your back. And other people will think you're completely mad, man. You've also got to think of your future. You know? But I think sometimes God's Spirit, that's how God's Spirit sometimes works. You know? And you give it, and actually the person who's receiving the most is yourself. Because you've had an opportunity to share something of yourself without having to expecting any kind of reward, if that makes any sense to you. You know, so sometimes the wise management thing is the interest or whatever it may be. You know, let me give you an illustration from Scripture. The suggestion is, particularly in the Old Testament, that you give a tenth. But Jesus seems to suggest, if you're going to measure out each little bit, you've lost the essence of what giving is about. You know, if you're going to give me a birthday present because you happen to be my family and you're obligated to give me a birthday present, take your birthday present and shove it where it's easiest to keep. You understand? Don't come with your gifts to God and say, I hope you're watching, 1/10. It's a hell of a lot of money. 1/10, I'm giving it. Because I've got a feeling, not that God would use my language, that he'd say, darling, keep your gift. This is more about you than about anybody else. You know what I mean? And it's the ability, you know. I mean, some of the stuff that we can learn from the poor sometimes is that. You know, there's just no question about our responsibility in gathering around one another and giving. There's just no question about it. And it comes from their guts, as it were. So that would be the beginning of an answer to you, you know. And I think some of the stuff that all three of you are raising is that sometimes it's good to actually talk about the untouchable stuff. You know, particularly in a church setting. You know, because some of the stuff can be very, very, very hurtful. To come to some of the stuff that you've spoken about, and you might need to remind me if I miss some of it. One of the things that we need to recognize about apartheid is that it was a policy of marginalization, not just in terms of color. You know, I don't know whether any of you know about the politics of Somalia. Do any of you know any of the politics? Well, Somalia basically has got two major ethnic groups. The one are the pastorals, who are in power and have been since 1960, and the other are the Bantu. And so the Somalians that you have in this country are mostly from the Bantu tribe. And it's almost 9 provinces. But, I mean, and it's a classic apartheid state. Don't just think that South Africa is the pariah of the world for having imagined this. You understand? And the Bantu are completely marginalized. Marginalized economically, their children are not educated. So I've had some dealings with them, and one of the critical things that we're trying to look at is, besides looking at maybe a way of negotiating a different narrative for Somalia, is can't you do just something to begin to help our children to be educated? Now you can imagine most of Somalia is Muslim, coming to a Christian minister asking for help. You know, it is bizarre. But to come to your thing, apartheid basically demolished the future of 80% of our community. You understand? And the ripple effect of that stuff still sits with us. You know? Let me be honest with you, it's a hell of a struggle for white people to get over what has been put in there for years. And no matter how much, you know, somebody might say to me, you're a racist. If I react to that angrily, then I must know that I am a racist. I've got some cockroaches crawling around in my shoes that I haven't yet managed to sort out properly yet. And when I see black people, there is a little sign that goes up. Nobody would recognize it. Nobody would know, especially somebody who's been in the church for so long. But boy, we learn to smile in one another's faces. Be with me. So one has to recognize that we bring with us a legacy that, I mean, it is fascinating that the Dutch Reformed Church, which really theologically supported and gave a mandate to apartheid, in actual fact has moved light years from there, because their repentance has been so much easier. The Methodist Church, which declared that it was one and undivided in 1958, is still struggling with the most vicious racism, because we just will not admit it. And I think that, and we, you know, I mean, some of the stuff you might not know that goes on in the politics of the church is pernicious. But because we said in 1958 that we're one and undivided, and we waltzed through, I was the first white that was placed beside the missionaries in a black circuit in 1987. I moved in there. You with me? And it wasn't a huge disgrace or a huge thing. It was one of the most privileged things that the church could have done for me. Because the church actually said in 1987, it doesn't actually matter what the policy of the land, you will go there. And what I learned, I mean, I kind of went on a learning curve like this, and I'd finished all my studies apparently. Does that make sense to you? And still, the privilege of being able to learn from the other. You know? And let me say, when we're talking about inequality, can I dare to say to you, instead of seeing it as a judgmental challenge, whatever it is, if we can begin to start reframing it in our minds as an opportunity of exploring our humanity, different dimensions of our humanity. I'm telling you, very often, I think that the most privileged place for me to be is amongst the poorest of the poor. And if we're going to see it as a threat, we're going to be caught. If we begin to start thinking that people who have got to really measure every little thing that they have for their sake and their families, we begin to start prizing open a door that can begin to start enabling us to understand ourselves better. And I'm not saying it in a paternalistic way, because if you're going to look after the poor, feeling sorry for them, it's another thing like the Christmas present. You know? Dependency and entitlement amongst the poor is the most profound insult. Let me give you this little bit of money that I've got over here. Oh, I feel so good about that. And what do you feel?
I dare not say.
Yeah, no. You'd like to tell me to take my money and shove it if you could. It was interesting this last week. There was a program that was run at the center, and one of the young people there did some cooking for the organizer, and she gave him 200 rand for it, and he thinks he's worth much more than that. And he did cook a beautiful meal for them and the rest of it. So he said to me, I'm going to take her money and I'm going to give it back to her. She can shove it where she wants it, because she has treated me like a poor black. You know what it feels like to be a poor white, and for the family to come around you feeling sorry. You know, they can't converse with you on any level of humanity at all. Black people, strangely enough, have got the same kind of idea about their humanity. And if you have been poor, if you've ever known what poverty is, you will know what I'm talking about. My mother was the youngest of 9, and she, her father thought it was because she was so pretty she didn't need education, so he sent her to school at the age of 9, and then the family kind of collapsed, so she got a standard 6. I think she was a very clever woman. She was the first woman to be a manager in this permanent building society. So, and she was very, very astute. You with me? With her standard 6 education. But in actually, and then she decided the one thing that they would never take away from me was an education. So she sent me to St. Stithians College. I mean, she must have had rocks in her head. You know, And I waltzed through St. Stithians College with all the trauma of separation from the family and all the rest of it. And you know, it was only when I was bishop of that district and I went to the council meetings at St. Stithians and I started looking at the calculations of what it cost her, that I thought, glory, how did this woman cope? When she retired in 1978, and thank heaven she died at the beginning of 1979, her pension was 79 Rand a month. But I never suspected that we were as poor as we were. My brother-in-law once said to her, Ruthie, we want to build this nice house, and the only condition we'll build it is if you and Paul come and live with us. And my mother said to him, Willie, never. I will remain independent. Thank you. Very sweet thought, but thank you. And believe it or not, poor people are like that. They have a deep sense of the only thing that they have is the knowledge that they are made in the image of God, even if they're in rags. And that just to some kind of response, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I mean, if you see how many people live there in squalor, it's actually frightening. And I said to him one day, Danny, how come there's all this xenophobia and you're burning the shops? He says, no, that's the black South Africans that are too lazy to work. Then they accuse these guys of taking their jobs, but they've done nothing about setting up their own spaza shop. And you learn from that. I mean, my uncle had his farm taken from him in Zimbabwe. He used to put aside on his farm 3 hectares, he'd plow it, you'd say to them, I want 20 then Zimbabwe dollars, not US dollars, to cover the fertilizer. The fuel, the hours, the wages he paid for. Those crops were given to his staff. I mean, those farmers down in the Larayville and all that area could do exactly the same. And they would be feeding the starving. Victoria, Swanee, grows by 1 million people a year. How do you put them in houses? How do you get water to them? How do you educate them? We have 168 informal settlements around the Swanee area. The council can help 3 of them. And then if you look at it, it starts at central government, provincial government, down to the council, that have sat and done nothing for years. And we have starving people in this country, millions of them. Now the land claim is to so-called give those people land to stop them starving. How are you going to stop them starving? If they've got no access to money, they cannot even buy the maize to plant to grow their own food. We sit with big problems.
Now there are 20 million people who go to bed at night hungry. Are you with me? And so you raise a whole question of how do we manage moving the assets that we have in a way that gives dignity to all people, you know? And it's there isn't a simple answer, but I do want to tell you this. When we begin to start talking together like this, in a group like this, I happen to think that the church is one of the most hopeful places in society. Because you think of who comes through these doors every Sunday. Just think of it. Think of the connections. You with me? For one. Think of the intellect, the combined intellect. And then one just takes one of the issues that you've raised. Let's look at the issue of informal settlements, you know, which is a phenomenon. There isn't a single town in South Africa that does not have an informal settlement. Now, I went and observed the elections in Zimbabwe. Okay? And Zimbabwe's got very high levels of poverty, very high. And part of the poverty in Zimbabwe is similar to some of the reasons that we've got the poverty. But will you believe me if I tell you that I did not see one informal settlement? Not one shack. Now there must be something in Zimbabwe that can teach us. And you would be surprised that in a church like Westview, you've got people who have an ability to imagine alternatives. And so you begin to start putting something like that together because we're concerned about the inequality, because it contradicts our faith. It makes our faith impotent. You with me? And how do we then begin to start, first of all, imagining something different? And secondly, how do we plan it? And then thirdly, how do we get it onto the implementation level? Now, I do want to tell you, I think that there are people in a community like this who can do that kind of thing. You know? But it does mean, with due respect, that you've got to start imagining church in another way. So you have your time of worship, and after the time of worship, you have a planning committee that begins to start taking seriously what you can deal with in this area. You know, that secures people's dignity, that begins to start making an inroad into another place. Those people that came and stayed in Central Methodist knew one thing. This is not your destination, and you don't sit here Googling nothing all day. You will be out of the building at 8 o'clock because you need to try and get yourself integrated into this country with a job and wherever you go. And you go into Johannesburg and 90% of your restaurants are peopled by Zimbabweans. You with me? Now, and it was remarkable eventually. We had training in sewing, in embroidery, in woodwork, in metalwork, in computers, in computer repairs, and they used to come every Friday night and they used to report on where their programs were going. Now, it wasn't the solution to everything. And in the end, when they were so many of them were evicted into squalor. But the church holds so much potential. You know, and particularly, I'm sorry to say, but I'm sure it's true about other denominations, but the Methodist Church organizes very carefully and very well. It's not pie in the sky when you die, you know. It will ask relevant questions. But I sense that we're a congregation that congregates and congregates and congregates. And I don't know your congregation, so you must know what I'm looking at from outside, you know. And one of the signs of being psychologically challenged, let me put it that way, is that you've got no imagination. You wanting to say, yeah.
One of the biggest inequalities I think we've got is in the earning amount and wages. I'll give you a very good example. Painters around here are charging 250, 300 rand a day. I went to the dentist and after 15 minutes I got a bill for 1,200 rand.
You're lucky.
You add that up. How do you...
Yeah. So you see, I think that
to me is huge.
But that's the question that needs to be asked. Now, you must come to where I am, you know. Now, we've got about 150 people living on the property. So let me be blunt with you. We've constantly got problems with electricity, and we've constantly got problems with sanitation. Heaven only knows what people imagine putting down toilets. You with me? So we get the professionals in, and the professionals say, this is going to cost you 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 to fix. All right? So I say to one of the people that I know is connected into the community, can you get somebody to please come in here and fix it? They come in, they spend a day, 250 Rand. You with me? Now, you see, somehow that conversation can take place in a church. You're not going to get that through a council. You understand? And that's why our connectedness and our intelligence. Let me say to you, your political parties don't have the connections that you have. You're right on the ground. Nobody can tell you stuff about your place. That's nonsense. You know. You know. So you have two things that are powerful. First of all, you know this. I bet you know this place better than the councillor, who makes decisions up there about what happens down here. I bet you have a political power to be able to mobilize amongst one another much better than your councillor. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the truth. You with me? So just in terms of your politics, you are far more qualified. And you need to recognize that. You're not stupid. You have good interpretive skills. You have a way of organizing. I mean, where on what's today, Wednesday? Where on a Wednesday do you get more than 30 people into a room to start talking about the real issues that are being faced? But please don't just leave here and leave it. And you've got to recognize that the people who make the changes, I'm sorry to have to say to you, at this level are not the politicians. It's people like yourselves. But make no error, you've got to do it carefully. You're not going to change the paradigm by dreaming about it in a church hall. You can come back to the church hall and then put specifics in place. What is one thing in this area that emerges as the most critical issue we've got to look at? You raise it. Is it in education with the children? Is it, because that is a huge issue in this country at the moment, the quality of education right across the board. Our children are coming out of school, and they don't know how to think, let alone read. You know, so they don't have a critical mindset. They have a Baba black sheep mindset. You understand? Now, you wanted to ask a question.
My question is now squeezing in amongst everything that you've said. Are we as a church, is our perception of inequality and what we're talking about? We're talking about the slaves and the slave owners, the poor and the rich all coming to church together. Is it the same inequality as what the masses are talking about? Should we not be doing something different and not saying, welcome everybody into church? That doesn't help them, apart from, I'm saying, making them feel good by coming to church. Is there not something else we can do, as you are now saying, help them here, do this? Can we have not something definite that can be done?
I mean, I think that your question is your answer. So one of the things you're saying is that equality comes on different levels.
Yes,
you know?
Everybody wants money. Everybody wants a position, but they're not qualified for it. I would love to get the money of a surgeon. I'd love to get the money of the dentist that the man was talking about. I'm not qualified to be a dentist. I would not be capable of that position. But I was happy with the position that I was in life. Can these people now not be so demanding for a job at this height when actually they could get enough money to live at a job there without disrupting everybody?
You see, one of the things that you're talking about is the whole issue of class. You with me? And I don't want to answer your question because I think the intricacy of the question opens up all sorts of things. Many of you in this place are retired. Now, I'm retired, believe it or not. And I want to tell you, I think retirement is a load of hogwash. And I tell you why. Because as people reach the point in which they have had life experience, they've had to take their academic knowledge, whether it is in a simple job or in a very fancy job as a dentist, okay? And by the way, dentists suffer more from depression than any other profession. Let me just say, what you're raising is the fact that we cannot have a society where people are irrelevant. The dentist has got to recognize that the plumber is as important as her fiddling around in teeth. And so there needs to be that kind of adjustment in our thinking. But you can only say that kind of thing in a church, where, as your society steward, you may have a plumber. But you're not going to put a doctor in there because the doctor isn't good at leadership. He's good at fiddling around with body parts, but he's useless in his people skills. But the plumber has to work with people for his life. And so he's a good leader in the church. And so what really is a sort of much lower grade profession, in actual fact, is critical. So you understand, and it's as one begins in a place like this, and as you start recognizing that as so-called retired people, you're actually not like a preservative on a shelf, waiting to be embalmed in a stomach. And then I won't take you through the rest of the process. You understand? But in actual fact, and that does not mean that we don't take young people seriously. Not at all. In actual fact, if that's what you think, you're stupid. And if you also think that young people have got no wisdom, you're also stupid. But it does mean that you're not stupid. And it does mean that you're not irrelevant. And it does mean that at times you've got to get off your rear end and get moving, so that when you leave this mortal frame, you have 2 more talents to bring to the Lord. Instead of, I was retired, I had 1 talent, so I sat on it for the rest of my life. And here it is.